20 million people are on the brink of death. In under 3 years, violence, famine, and preventable disease have ravaged an entire nation. Yet the international community remains silent. It's time to talk about Yemen. For over 2.5 years, a war has been raging on in the Middle East that very few people have heard of. Thousands of civilians have died and millions more have been displaced. I'm not talking about the wars in Syria or Iraq. No, I'm talking about the other war in the Middle East taking place right now in Yemen. It's not a simple sectarian conflict as mainstream media would have you believe, but instead a full-scale civil war expanding beyond Yemeni borders. Like most wars, this one is incredibly complicated and involves many players. And like most wars, it's the civilians who suffer the most.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia launched military operations in Yemen. The objective is to defend the legitimate government of President Hadi. To prevent Yemen from falling at the hands of the Houthis.
The history of Yemen is as dramatic as many other former colonial countries. After gaining independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1918, northern Yemen was divided by internal conflicts. In 1967, southern Yemen gained independence from the British Empire, and 3 years later, the south was operating under a socialist form of government. For the next 2 decades, North and South Yemen fought a devastating war. But by 1990, the two countries finally agreed to unite, forming today's Republic of Yemen. But this union was merely territorial. Since then, divisions have continued and several armed conflicts have ensued. Let's take a look at the warring sides a bit closer. In the northern capital of Sana'a, you have the Houthis and other rebel groups. They are loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was ousted in 2011. By now, they control most of northern Yemen. To the south of Sana'a, centered in Aden, the country is in the hands of pro-government troops. There's the internationally recognized government of Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. Their forces are backed by the Saudi-led coalition. But there is one more force in Yemen. Southeast in Al-Makalla is where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has filled a vacuum left behind by all of the fighting in the rest of the country. I sat down with Dr. Sheila Carapico, professor of international studies at the University of Richmond, to get a deeper understanding about the warring factions and their goals. Dr. Carapico, can you explain the origins of this conflict?
The immediate origin of this conflict is in the 2011 uprising against Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power for more than 30 years and was preparing to transfer the presidency to his son. And there was a very sustained nationwide uprising that went on for months and months and months, which deeply worried the dynasties that rule the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council, who then stepped in with a kind of transition plan which they negotiated with Saleh to give him immunity from prosecution and to allow him to retain leadership of the majority party in Parliament.
So who are the Houthis? We always hear that they are a tribal people, but they do seem to be pretty organized.
They originally, more than 10 years ago, it's kind of a Zaidi revival movement in the governorate of Sada on the Saudi border, and it was really in response to Saudi and Wahhabi proselytizing, Salafi proselytizing in their area, and were part of the nationwide uprising during 2011. And then what was surprising, I mean, it caught me off guard, and I think most people, was the sudden alliance between Saleh and the Houthis. So we keep hearing about the Houthis are doing this and the Houthis are doing that, but a lot of it, it doesn't make sense that the Houthis, who again are a small local group, would be doing things like trying to capture Aden it really makes much more sense that Ali Abdullah Saleh would be trying to capture Aden.
We often hear that the conflict in Yemen is driven by a Shia-Sunni confrontation. Is there any credibility to that argument?
The sectarian conflict is a result rather than a cause of violence and civil war. The nationwide uprising during 2011, which went on for months and months and was indeed nationwide, that was Sunni and Shia together. There was no difference.
How much does foreign involvement contribute to all of the violence going on right now?
I mean, foreign involvement is the main source of the violence. So, I mean, most of the deaths from firepower have come from the air, which is to say from the Saudi-led, American-backed coalition. You know, the Houthis and Saleh, I mean, they're no angels, and they also have contributed. I mean, they commit what I think would plausibly be labeled war crimes.
Do you see any way for reconciliation?
You know, the new ambassador to the United States, and he was interviewed, and he said, we are trying to bring the Houthis to the negotiating table. All they need to do is surrender all their weapons, and then we'll negotiate with them. But that's not a negotiation. That's a demand for unconditional surrender. That's their position, is to keep them out completely, and it's the wrong approach.
As if the war isn't hard enough to understand with so many internal players, it's foreign involvement that has escalated the war to catastrophic proportions. RT correspondent Anya Parampil has more on outside forces shaping the conflict in Yemen.
Before the war in Yemen escalated to devastating proportions, the country was already the poorest in the Middle East, although surrounded by lavishly rich Gulf kingdoms. On March 26, 2015, those same wealthy kingdoms and their allies, with the exception of Oman, began a bombing campaign of Yemen, stating their intended targets were Houthi rebels. The mission was led by Saudi Arabia, with ground and air support for the assault provided by Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Sudan, and the American private mercenary group, Academy. Immigration attorney Abadir Bar says the crisis is exacerbated by these forces.
The Trump administration signed a $100 billion deal, arms deal with Saudi Arabia. And where do you think all those weapons, all those fighter jets, all those bombs are going to be headed to? Directly to Yemen.
The Houthi rebels are often mischaracterized as a proxy force of Iran. While it's true the Houthis receive support from the country, the group is an independent political movement grown out of Yemen, more comparable to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it's important to note the air campaign being waged against Yemen would not be possible without material, intelligence, and ground support from the United States.
It's a huge geopolitical war that's happening in Yemen, and it's not simply, you know, good or bad or this side or that side. It's not Rwanda where you're saying, you know, Tutsis and Hutus. You know, it's not Somalia where I'm originally from, where it's a clan warfare. It's quite literally foreign intervention in Yemen that's causing this, and it can be stopped simply by, you know, demanding that our government does not provide weapons and assistance to Saudi Arabia, and to take a stand and say enough is enough, and we shouldn't have a proxy war in a small country in the Middle East.
While the horrors of Yemen may seem like a far-off tragedy, in reality, U.S. taxpayer dollars are the greatest enabler of the crisis. Anya Parampil, RT.
Yemen is now home to the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. Here are the four horsemen: famine, sickness, death, and war. 17 million people are now food insecure, with 7 million more severely starving. Within the next decade, Yemen is expected to completely run out of water. So far, 10,000 people have died from illness directly due to the Saudi air blockade, which prevents medicine and food from entering the country and traps those who are sick from leaving. Another 12,000 have died from violence and 42,000 have been injured. 3 million are internally displaced, including those who have tried to flee but have since returned. An RT crew gained exclusive access to a remote village in Yemen and filed this disturbing report.
أنا ما في ولا فلوس ولا حاجة دور بين الدعاء دور بي ثمن دور بي ولا عندنا مسألة
أنا حاله لم أنا فلوس ولا أنا أي بيوت ولا مؤدبين حالت أنا حاله ولا أنا أي مستشفيات لا طب ولا طحن فلوس حق من نتعالج ولا عندنا حاجة.
In addition to hunger, over 500,000 people are suffering from cholera and other preventable diseases. Earlier, I spoke to Dr. Riaz Karim, a co-founder of the Mona Relief Organization, which provides aid to some of the most vulnerable communities in Yemen. Here's what he says civilians are facing on the ground.
The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is beyond comprehension at this point. I don't think the world actually knows the severity of what is going on in Yemen. When you take an entire country that is 90% dependent on foreign imports to sustain itself and put it under a blockade for almost 3 years, that country is basically going to come to its knees. I will give you an example of a horror story. One of our people heard a little girl crying in a hut, and she was continuously crying. And so he decided to basically go into that hut and see what was going on and why is this girl continuously crying since like half an hour. And when he actually got in there, the little girl was about 1 year old. Her mother was laying on the floor in a pool of blood. She had given birth to a baby, and both the mother and the baby did not make it. And the little girl was doing everything within her power to try and wake her mother up. Now, when you hear stories like that, it's not only heartbreaking, but it is also inhuman in so many ways that we can, as powerful nations around the world, can subject a small nation to this kind of atrocity. It is just unbelievable.
I asked the doctor to tell me about the scale of famine and the outbreak of cholera in the ravaged country, and he claims the situation is beyond critical.
They don't have the very basic necessities, which is basically a human right for everybody, and that is clean drinking water and proper sanitation. That's one of the basic human rights that we provide ourselves on an everyday basis. Those people don't have that. They have been bombed to pieces, and the water wells have been destroyed. Everything has basically been destroyed out there. When you have a situation like that, you're obviously going to have, cholera, dysentery, dengue fever. These are very common when you're living in circumstances like those. Let's put it this way: when you have one piece of bread and a packet of tomato ketchup feeds a family of 5, that is pretty atrocious, I would say. People do not have food. Sometimes it is a choice between what we're going to eat or whether we should take our child to the hospital. And 90% of the time, the child will end up dying because there's so many other children who are sitting hungry. The parents have basically sold everything that they owned that had, even the minutest of value in order to feed their children.
Dr. Riaz Karim also told me that Yemenis know well who's responsible for their plight, but their calls for justice fall on deaf ears.
They know that the people who are responsible for this is Saudi Arabia and the coalition, because when Saudi Arabia actually invaded Yemen, they were very, very close to coming to an agreement between the North and the South. And then the invasion happened, and everything went to hell in a handbasket then. And then what happens is that it started creating vacuums within Yemen, within the southern part of Yemen, where Al-Qaeda and Daesh have actually taken over a lot of the areas. And they're being funded by the outside actors. It's not like they're not getting the money. They're actually getting paid to do what they do. But, you know, they have free reign over theirs. And that vacuum is causing a huge problem right now, even for the coalition, because they don't know what else to do with them. I think our first responsibility is to try and see that we take care of fellow human beings. What is happening in Yemen is absolutely inhuman. And I don't think it should be happening in any country in this world. So please go read about it, educate yourself, and try to help. Make some noise and try to help Yemen. At least we can, together, I think we can do it.
Since the war began, Human Rights Watch has documented the use of at least 6 types of cluster munitions in Yemen, which are banned under international law. According to the NGO, the Saudi-led coalition is responsible for nearly all of these. Amnesty International has also been keeping account, stating that all parties in the conflict have committed war crimes and violated international law with impunity. New York-based immigration lawyer Julie Goldberg has filed a lawsuit on behalf of hundreds of Yemenis with U.S. visas who have been affected by the recent U.S. travel ban. Julie has been helping Yemenis flee the violence from her office in Djibouti, Africa, and she has witnessed the destruction firsthand. She joins me now to discuss this. Julie, how is U.S. foreign policy affecting the people in Yemen?
Well, it's not just the arms sales. For example, I was just, we have a boat that runs from Djibouti to Aden, and I was on that boat because I went on the first couple boats. And so the day I was there, in fact, I have a video of it, one of the U.S. drones had actually bombed Aden. And so it's not just a matter of foreign policy or arms sale. We're actively participating in what's going on.
So the air and naval blockades prevent aid from entering the country, but what about the aid organizations that are already on the ground? How are they holding up?
I think the biggest problem is, like, for example, I don't know if you saw, it was about 9-10 months ago, where the Saudis and the U.S. bombed the ABS hospital. It's Doctors Without Borders. So what's happening is, because, you know, in a civil war where you have people fighting on the ground, places like UNICEF, Red Cross can go in and isolate an area and create some sort of protections or safety or medical care or food or stuff. You don't have that in Yemen because it's basically an airstrike. And the Saudis have control of the airways. So what's happening is there's no area or safe place for a lot of the relief agencies and the aid to go in and help these people. And so internally, these people are getting absolutely no help whatsoever. Like, for example, in Syria, there are areas where, because it is a civil war and a lot of it's on the ground, there's areas where UNICEF has gone in and secured the area and is able to provide food and aid. That's not happening in Yemen, which I think is making it much, much worse.
So when these refugees flee, where do they go? What is their path to safety?
They're no longer allowed to go into Saudi Arabia. In the beginning, some of them were coming across the land border. The only way out now is by water. And I don't know if you're aware, but during July and August, none of the merchant ships run. I mean, it's the waters are so tumultuous that they don't run back and forth during that time. So what has to happen is, in order to get here, the only way to do it is you have to travel to Aden, which, given, you know, the combat and everything that's going on, is very unsafe. And once you make it to Aden, you then have to take a boat from Aden into Djibouti. And those boats run anywhere from 22 to 24 hours. There's not a lot of safe boats that are traveling. Some of the boats are made strictly for animals. And they're going into the water in July and August, which typically all boats are shut down in those months. So you can imagine how dangerous people must think it is over there to actually risk getting into a water at a time when boats just typically don't run. Right now, the people are really being taken advantage of. There is one particular guy who kind of has a monopoly, who is, one of his boats is actually relatively safe. The other ones aren't. He's charging exorbitant fees. He's taking advantage of these people. When the outbreak happened, they shut down all the boats. So it drove the price to about $1,000 to $1,500 a person, which is almost prohibitive for someone running from the war. And it got completely out of hand. And then when they started running boats again, which is when we had kind of put the boat in place, the prices dropped. Now, because of the outbreak again, and they're shutting down boats, the price is coming back up.
What happens when people reach Djibouti, and then from there, what happens when your clients reach the United States?
What's unfortunate is these people are running from the war, and they're getting taken advantage of from some of their own government people who have been displaced and aren't getting paid now. So they come into Djibouti and they're placed on the port, and then that's when kind of all the expenses start, because they've got to pay to get off the port. The Yemen ambassador over there actually is involved in some of this money taking, which is extremely unfortunate. And so they go through this lengthy process to get off the port, and when they finally do get off the port, then at that point is when they can have access to the U.S. Embassy. The people that are coming to the United States are, a lot of them are U.S. citizens that were just happened to be living in Yemen. The United States never did any sort of evacuation from Yemen, and so a lot of them are children that were born to U.S. citizens. A lot of them are the spouses of U.S. citizens, and so they have a place to stay here because generally they have family here. They either have a husband or a wife or a father or a mother, and so all of at least the refugees that are coming into the United States do have some sort of legal status. What's really important is not a lot of attention is being placed on Yemen right now. You know, there's that huge focus on Syria, 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 and I think the United States has focused on Syria because we have absolutely no involvement in what's going on. And I don't think people realize that what's going on in Yemen, the human casualties and the abuses are just as bad as what's going on in Syria. But I think that we're not focusing our attention there because we're actually the ones responsible for doing a lot of the bombing.
This reckless and ruthless war has caused a crisis 100% made by man, and yet it seems the mainstream media continues to choose sides. There is no shortage of reporting selling the idea that Saudi bombing is a necessity, even though civilians are killed in the process.
A new offensive to drive out Iranian-backed rebels who seized control of the capital and key military sites.
Saudi Arabians, they have been concerned about rebel forces, al-Qaeda forces in Yemen for years.
You also have this regional power game between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other.
Political order as we know it in the Middle East is shifting, and it's shifting obviously in favor of Iran.
To talk about the mainstream media's coverage of the war in Yemen and how it shapes public opinion of the conflict, I am joined by investigative journalist Ben Norton. Ben, what is your take on the mainstream media's coverage of Yemen?
For the first part, the conflict in Yemen is not a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, we constantly hear in media outlets that the Houthi movement inside Yemen are Iranian-backed, even Iranian proxies. But this is simply false. Iran's influence inside Yemen is very minimal. In fact, even a mainstream U.S. government-funded think tank, the Carnegie Middle East Center, has published research acknowledging this. They published a report called Iran's Small Hand in Yemen, which acknowledges that the reports of supposed Iranian arms shipments into Yemen have never been independently corroborated. You know, these are claims made by the U.S. government in Saudi Arabia. Oman, which they claim the arms shipments are going through, has explicitly denied that Iran is sending weapons to the Houthis.
Well, why is this a narrative? What is the difference between Iran's brand of Shia Islam and the Houthis' brand?
The Zaidi Muslims inside Yemen are actually much more similar to Sunnis than they are to Twelver Shias, who make up the majority of the Iranian population. But of course, Saudi Arabia, for political reasons, has tried to turn these 40% of Yemenis into supposed Shia, because under state Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, these are non-Muslims, they're heretics, they're polytheists. And what that sectarian narrative does is it provides ammunition to Saudi Arabia by which they can demonize Yemeni Muslims and essentially consider them inferior and non-Muslim, and then also try to tie them to Iran.
Western officials say Iran is running weapons to the Houthis. What evidence is there of that?
The allegations that Iran is sending these weapons via boat are highly suspect, because Saudi Arabia, with the help of the U.S. Navy, has been imposing a brutal blockade, navally and also in terms of air, on Yemen, which prevents any kind of arms shipments from being sent via the water. And then the allegations that Iran is sending weapons through Oman have been denied by the Omani government. And this is unlikely because the Houthis do not control the area inside Yemen on the border with Oman that the weapons would need to travel through. So again, these are all attempts to try to justify foreign war on Yemen by falsely portraying it as a proxy conflict and not what it actually is, a U.S.-Saudi war on Yemen.
Do you think the United States deal with Iran affected Saudi Arabia's decision to get involved in this conflict?
There's no question that Saudi Arabia has been terrified by the growing influence of Iran. And unlike Iran, Saudi Arabia has not pursued diplomacy. Saudi Arabia has invaded its southern neighbor and launched more than 90,000 air sorties, killing thousands of civilians and destroying much of the infrastructure of the country. And, certainly part of this is supposedly justified by Saudi Arabia based on fears of purported Iranian influence inside Yemen. And they've been incredibly worried by especially the Iran nuclear deal and the potentials of rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. I think that's exaggerated. There's no question that the U.S., even under Barack Obama, was still considering and pursuing regime change against Iran.
Ben, the Saudi-led coalition has been accused of committing war crimes. How credible are those allegations?
There's no question Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented multiple war crimes committed by the U.S.-Saudi coalition. The bombing of a funeral that killed more than 140 people and wounded 500 others. I mean, double and triple strike attacks on hospitals run by Doctors Without Borders. And then in addition to that, Saudi Arabia has been using cluster munitions, which are banned by more than 100 countries. And these cluster munitions have been made by the US and the UK. And the UK has provided, hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons and support to Saudi Arabia as well as the US. So there's no question that the US-Saudi-led coalition is responsible for the majority of the civilian casualties. The UN has repeatedly said that and has committed flagrant war crimes inside Yemen.
Saudi Arabia and its allies have failed to reinstall Hadi as the country's leader, leaving Yemen completely in shambles. So is there an end in sight for this war? Earlier, I spoke with Will Pickard, Executive Director of the Yemen Peace Project.
Right now, specifically, we are trying to get the U.S. out of the civil war in Yemen and more resolutely involved in the peace process. The big thing that we need right now is to get the international community, and particularly the U.S., to resolutely and vocally back the peace process so that it can move ahead. I agree that the U.S. cannot act as a peace broker while it's also supporting one of the sides of the conflict and, in fact, acting as a party to the conflict itself. So what we're trying to do is stop the flow of U.S. arms to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, remove the U.S. from the conflict so it can take on a diplomatic role. We believe that in order for the UN peace process to progress, it needs to also become more inclusive, and that means making sure that all of the factions that are involved in the conflict, so the southern factions, tribal militias, and party-based militias, are all involved in the negotiations because they're the ones doing the fighting on the ground. And in addition to that, what we really need to see is the UN Security Council members, especially the US, but all of those council members, really getting on the same page and committing to moving the process forward rather than acting on behalf of their allies in the region.
I've only scratched the surface of what's going on in Yemen. There are still many other issues that need to be investigated. But the more we talk about it, the higher the chances are that the international community will do something. As a journalist, all I can do is shine a light on the actions of these governments and hope that it affects change. James Reston once wrote, "All politics are based on the indifference of the majority. So it's time to start making a difference. Millions of lives depend on it."